and hopefully that might also help with some of that CPU. So today we are going to be talking about Mockery, and Mockery is a testing. It's one of the testing frameworks. It specializes in creating test objects. We'll talk a little bit more about why we want to create test objects here in a second, but let me first kind of back up and talk about this project setup. So let's dump out these remotes. So if you go out on GitHub, you can see under Jason McCreary, start testing PHP. I have a sample project. We used this last time, but basically inside of there, I've also created several branches. And what I've done is check out this Mockery base. And what that's done is kind of given me not only the composer setup with all the dependencies that we want, but also some files that we'll use to kind of start testing and start kind of exploring with Mockery. So this is the same project we used last time. We started, I think, on master with the collection base, and we were getting familiar with PHPUnit. So this time, like I said, we kind of jump out to this Mockery base, and then each one has a base, and then there's also a final. So if you take off the base suffix when we're done today, hopefully it'll look very much like the Mockery final result. So after the fact, if you guys want to take a look at this repo and just kind of look at the differences between the files and so forth, there's several things in here. I think stuff is just a local one where I have a script that I use, because I normally give this in conference workshops and so forth, so it's actually like a 4-hour workshop. So I've broken this up into 3 or 4 different of these kind of online workshops. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. I've already run Composer install, so everything should be fine there. I'm running PHPUnit, which again we talked about last time, and then Mockery. Again, Mockery is something that allows you to create test objects. And the reason we would want to do this is basically while we're testing our system, obviously there's going to be collaboration between objects within the system. And in order to test and kind of facilitate testing, sometimes we may want to kind of control the way those objects interact with each other to test something in isolation. There's a lot of different words that people use for this. So let me just, let's do this actually. Let me just run a git status, and let me get us like a little workspace bit here. So let me run a git clean fd. We'll just clean everything out. I'm going to jump back to PHP Storm. And let's make this just a little bit larger for us. Okay, cool. So basically, let me jump in this README file. I'm going to get rid of this. So there's a lot of different what people call test objects. And a common term for that is basically double. So they'll call them a test double. And what that means is kind of a stand-in, right, for these real objects, right? We have these real objects that are obviously what are used when our application truly runs in production. But when we run under the test environment, we might want to, again, double these out using these test objects. And that's what Mockery allows us to do. There's a lot of different kinds of test objects. There's, fakes, there's dummy objects, there's mock objects, hence the name Mockery. Some people actually go so far as to kind of be specific and talk about stubs. And there's more. There's a lot more here. People can be really, trying to think of the right word, maybe pedantic about these. There's a great post by Martin Fowler who kind of breaks these down into kind of the differences between them. I recently kind of paraphrased that in one of my Dev2 articles, so those that have seen those or found this workshop through there, you might have already read this, but I'll share it in Slack at the end of this workshop. The point really here is that there are some nuances about how these things work differently. So for example, a dummy object might not be faked, or it might not be something that you build with Mockery, for example. It might just be a true like physical object in your system that you have, set up or something that you use in its place. Null can even be a dummy test object, right? You can just pass in null because it doesn't really matter for the purpose of your test, so you just kind of dummy it. So again, there's a lot of different examples of these. What Mockery focuses on, actually I remembered one of the other ones here, sorry, it's going to be important. So there's also something called Spies. So Mockery really excels in this mock and spy section. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on today. So what I want to do is let's get away from some of this terminology, because I think the final point I was going to make is that when you're starting out, the nuances between these don't really matter. They might over time, and again, some people might be very specific about the way in which they want to use certain test objects while they're testing their system, but it's not something that I think is really critical, especially in the beginning. So I'm not going to focus too much on the difference here, although I will demonstrate for the purposes of Mockery what it kind of means for the differences between mock and spy. So I'm going to jump in my test directory here, and again, your project setup doesn't necessarily have to be the same as this, but what I'm going to do is let's just make a Mockery test, and I'm going to say okay. So this is just a Mockery test.php, and what I'm going to do is this is just going to be a class, and this is just a PHP unit test basically. So I'm going to call it Mockery test. I'm going to extend PHP, whoops, that's the old way. I'm going to extend test case here, and let's auto import that correctly. And let's import the class. That is a PHP unit framework test case. So first thing I want to point out here is that Mockery does not have, like, it's not a full-on testing framework. It really focuses on those test objects. So we're going to be using PHPUnit still to write all of our tests, but we're going to be using Mockery to potentially create some of these test objects to help us test our different classes. So I'm going to get to that in a second, but to start out here, let's basically just make kind of a base mock, or let's do this test base mock, and just to kind of get a feel for the behavior of what Mockery is doing. So what I'm going to do is just use Mockery to make a simple mock, and I'm not going to set anything else up on here, right? So it's that simple. You basically just create a mock object. And what this is a just vanilla, nothing special about it, straight up Mockery mock. It's not mocking any kind of class, it's not doing anything, it's really just your super generic mock object. And what I can do with mock is I can say mock should receive, and let's say, let's just make up a totally, basic method name here. So let's just say should receive a call to something, right? And I'm going to have it and return 5, right? So what this sets up in this case is it's saying, okay, I have this mock object. That object's going to receive a call to something, and when it does, I want it to return 5. And let's go ahead and make just a basic PHPUnit assertion here. So let's assert same, and again from last time, I like to use assert same instead of assert equals, just to be super explicit about it. So let's say that when I call mock something, that I should get 5 back, right? So very contrived test here, but what we want to demonstrate is that I've created an object out of thin air, and I've kind of set it up, right? I've stubbed it out, if you will, to be that whenever I call something, it's going to return 5. And then I'm basically just making this assertion that, hey, when I actually call this mock object, it's going to give me back 5 when I call something on the mock object. So let's save that. And I'm going to jump back over here, vendor bin PHPUnit, and everything passes. There we go. So let's actually change this, because like I said, anytime I headshot something on the first time, I'm always a bit skeptic, so let's change that to 6. And we get a failure. Failed asserting that 5 is identical to 6. So there's a couple interesting things that are happening here. Let's put this back. So let me just go over this a little bit more. So Mockery gives us a mock object. You can think of it like a standard class, right? And what it allows us to do is stub things out on it. So there's one of those terminologies, right? We can basically stub out any method that we want with it, and we can tell it to do something else. So even though in the real world we might have an object that our class uses, and it calls this method something, I can tell it to return 5, instead of whatever it would really do, right? I can just completely have this stand-in test object, right? This mock object, and I can control what it's doing to allow me to better test the class. That way I'm not testing, this entire system. I'm still able to kind of test in isolation, right? I'm still able to write somewhat of a unit test. Even though there's collaboration between objects that's happening, I'm able to kind of focus down and test that one thing in isolation because I've controlled all the other things around it. And these test objects allow me to do that. There's a few more nuances before we get into some real-world code. So let's do one more thing here. Let's just say that I want to try to call something else, right? And I haven't stubbed this out, right? I haven't set it up to receive anything. I've only set up something, not the something else method. So let's save this and run that. So we see that we don't necessarily get a failure here, we get an exception. And let me turn on colors because that's just lame without it. There we go. So, okay. So we see that we get an exception here, and the exception is Mockery. Unfortunately, Mockery is not very good about its names for mock objects, but we see that method something else does not exist on this mock object. So by default, Mockery's mocks, if you don't stub out a method and it's called, it's actually going to throw an exception. So it's not going to allow you to do that. So it's very strict, if you will, about if you create this test object, you need to set up everything about it for it to not complain, to not throw an exception. So let's just say something else. And in this case, let's return null, just for giggles. And down here, I'll say assert null. If I can get my casing right there. There we go. All right, so I've set it up now. Let's see if this exception goes away. And everything passes. Great. 1 test, 2 assertions. So everything's fine. There's a couple other ways that you can do that. But again, the important thing here is that by default, you have to stub everything out with a mock. You have to set it up everywhere. So you have to say these should receive, should receive. So if you have a mock that's doing, if you're going to use a mock and it's going to do a lot of things, there's some other properties that you can give these mocks. So for example, you can say something like should ignore missing here. And what that means is that if you don't have something stubbed out, by default, it's going to automatically return null. So let's run this again and everything should still pass. But notice that I don't have something else, but down here it automatically returns null because I told it to ignore missing. Now a lot of this is in the documentation, but Mockery's documentation isn't like some other documentation where you can kind of see each one of the methods listed out. You're welcome to take a look at it, but it's a bit more like a book, and it's not a complete book. There's some chapters missing here and there, if you will. So, but just to kind of drive this point home, let's just say that we wanted something else to be 2. We should get a failure here, not the exception that we saw before, but a true failure from PHPUnit saying failed asserting that null is identical to 2. And again, that's because should ignore missing by default won't forcibly throw those exceptions. It's just going to throw nulls instead. Anytime you call something that you haven't stubbed out and you've set the mockup to ignore missing, it'll basically just return null everywhere. So, all right, let's do one more kind of learning bit here, and then we will move on to some real-world code. So let's test a class mock. And what I want to demonstrate here is that what I can create is a mock. Let's mock this task object, right? I have this pretty basic just model, if you will, of tasks. And we'll talk about this in a second. But basically what this system is doing is you can think of it like a task list. Pretty simple, straightforward, everyday example, right? And so the models here are basically each task has a note, right? It's just the content of what that task is. There's nothing else. There's no other really properties here. There's no ID or completed date or anything like that yet. We're going to push that out. We're going to drive that out as we keep testing. Maybe not today, but in the future. So right now, though, what I want to do is just demonstrate that I can use Mockery to basically mock a class. So let's say Mockery, mock, and what I'm going to do here is give it the task class name. And I just follow this convention because you could put in a name of the class there and it'll actually try to auto resolve for you. But I like using this class property because it gives me some kind of runtime checks to make sure that class didn't change its name or move anything else, move around in some other way. So again, I could have said as a string here, task, or even the full namespace, start testing your PHP models task. Could have said a few different things here, but instead of doing all that, I like to leverage PHP's class constant here, static class property, I guess is more accurately what that is. And when I create this mock, instead of just being this dummy mock, it's actually going to be a mock of this task. So technically, it's going to extend the task class and then throw in some of the additional Mockery goodies there to allow us to do things. So in this case, I can say should receive, let's do that get note, that getter. We're going to stub out that getter and say and return whatever. And down here we can do this, assert same, whatever. Whoops, when we call mock, what is this, get note, right? All right, let's go ahead and run our test here. And good, everything passes. So again, very closed loop demonstration here, but the point is that we can, extend this class, which is going to not only help us out and kind of give us a bit of a template with all the different methods that are possibly available, but it's also going to allow us to do things in our code where, let's say, for example, we're using type hinting, right? And we expect that something's going to receive or return a class. Well, by mocking it in this fashion, we're now able to pass those tests, right? Because again, underneath the covers, Mockery is really just extending this class that we tell it and adding on some additional methods and kind of magic happening to allow it to intercept and kind of change these different calls, right? But it would help with things like type hinting or anytime you're doing instance of or any kind of type checking that's happening within your system. So I like to try to use some kind of, I guess an instance mock, if you will. So in this case, this is a mock of the task class. I like to use these as much as possible. It's very rare that I'll make just kind of this empty or generic mock, because a lot of the times when I'm doing something like this, it's possible that I probably just could have used some other type of dummy object, meaning some other kind of like real world object, whether it be just some standard class that I threw some properties on or whatever. Again, I like to try to name them as much as possible. Okay, so let's see some of this in the real world, right? So let's make, in fact, let's just delete this file. And let's make a new test repository class. So what I'm going to do is task repository test. Don't need the PHP. And let's do class task repository test. I think I was saying that backwards. Extends test case. And again, that's a PHPUnit test case. All right, cool. So what we're going to test is this task repository. And this looks a little bit more like maybe some real world code that you might have, right? You have some kind of data access object here, in this case kind of the repository pattern, where you're basically using it to kind of manage all of your database connectivity and so forth. So instead of kind of querying the data directly in line with your code, you're going to be asking this repository to say, hey, get me all of the tasks, create a task. We can imagine that there would be other, CRUD-like operations in here, or other kind of helper methods to maybe get you recent tasks or completed tasks or whatever. So this is a nice way to abstract all of the all of that kind of SQL out of here. So, but the important piece in this class is this piece here. And so let's talk a little bit about, I guess, how test objects can be helpful, or say some requirements for them to be helpful, right? And a lot of times that requirement is basically, simply put, as dependency injection. If you're not familiar with dependency injection, basically that means that instead of, for example, here creating a new MySQL object in line, right? I'm instead passing it into the constructor, right? So I'm creating a task repository, and I'm saying that, okay, in order for the task repository to do its job, it depends on a database connection. And so you have to pass that database connection in as well. The nice thing about this, instead of doing it inline, as I've kind of written here, is it now gives me a hook into this class to be able to kind of test that collaboration, right? And that's the whole point of this, is that in order for us to even be able to use a test object, we need a way to kind of pass that test object into our system. And dependency injection, or even method injection, so for example down here on create note, we would have the ability to pass in some kind of note data, right, to manipulate it. So any kind of injection, right, whether it be at the class level or at a method level, is going to allow us those hooks that we need to potentially pass in some kind of test object. So if you have code that looks a bit like this, you're going to have to do some pre-refactoring to where you are now changing that to kind of be passed in a different way. To be passed in to the actual object so you can then use it. Now this creates some other problems, right? Dependency injections, it's not really necessarily just that simple, right? You can't just go replace those news, because somewhere someone has to create that database connection, right? But that's something, if you have some legacy code that you could do and just some kind of configuration script, you can make some kind of provider that kind of gives you those back in a way, right? Or you can look into I guess different kind of containers out there. There's a lot of different ones in the PHP community. Obviously, if you're using any kind of framework, they probably have some kind of inversion of control or IOC container that kind of helps you map all these and kind of figures all that out for you. Definitely a talk for a different time, but the simplest thing to do today is basically just to change the constructor to accept a MySQL connection. So now that we have this hook here, let's kind of start messing around with this a little bit more. So let's say that I want to test this all method. Given that I have this database connection, I now can make some assertions on all to ensure that these different paths are working correctly. And as far as today goes, again, I'm really kind of testing more at what people would call the unit testing level. So I'm really wanting to test kind of that each one of these things is happening, right? I'm not necessarily testing more of an integration test, if you will, where I call all and I get everything back that was in some kind of test database, like it's truly behaving. Instead, again, we're going to be at a much more granular level here, where we're actually testing that the code's kind of doing what we expect it to do, right? So for example, we want to test that it's calling a query and getting them in, descending order, right? So we kind of want to make sure that this query is the query that is run. Some people aren't the biggest fan of testing kind of in this way. Again, when you're starting out, I think it's good to kind of get the feel for it and see what works for you, and see what makes sense as far as your code base goes. So today, let's just go ahead and test this, kind of, again, line by line, if you will. So I'm going to split the screen here and make life a little easier to look at both sides. And let's bring our test back up. Okay, so let's test all, and let's kind of test just starting out here. So I see a couple different paths. Anytime I'm looking at a new class that I want to test, or if I'm driving out, especially if I'm testing legacy code, I kind of want to take a look at the different paths here. So immediately the very first path I see is that, okay, this query is run and somehow it returns false, and so I would expect to get back an empty array. So that's kind of path 1 there. So let's test that. So I'm going to say public function test all returns empty array when query result is false. So again, very specific test here, just for that very specific path. So the first thing we want to do is we need to make a task repository, right? So we can simply say new task repository, and the question now is, we need to pass in a MySQL, this MySQL database connection, right? So what we can do is we can actually make a fake one here. This is exactly what we want to do, right? This is the whole point of Mockery. So let's go ahead and set up that fake one real fast. So let's just say something like db connection is equal to Mockery mock, and I am going to attempt to mock the MySQL class. Again, if you can, try it. So let's definitely attempt to do that. And then I'm going to pass that into this db connection class, right? And this is going to be my subject. This is what I'm testing, right? Subjects does a nice shorthand inside of tests. It's really common to talk about the subject under test or the SUT. So anytime I'm inside of a test where I have multiple test cases, instead of calling this like task repository, I like to call it subject, because that just lets me know, hey, this is the thing I'm testing. This is my test subject, right? That's where you get the name from. So we're going to pass this in, and now let's set up some assertions on this. So we've got our new task repository. It's subject. Effectively, we want to call subject all, not ass. And then let's actually make an assertion on that, right? I'm just going to be a little pedantic right now. So let's say this is my actual result, right? And then I want to assert, let's assert same. And I basically am expecting an empty array back, and this is what I actually got back. And we'll condense some of this code here in a second. So I'm just jumping ahead a little bit, and let's go ahead and run this and see what kind of explosions happen. So let's work through it together here. Okay, cool. So first of all, class start testing PHP repositories task repository not found. Okay, so it seems like there might be a little bit of an issue with my auto load. So let's fix that real quick. Auto load. All right, let's see if that helps. It still does not. Okay, what am I missing here? Let's slow down. Okay, that seems correct. Let me just make sure I am auto-loading that in my... So, test suite name, start testing PHP. Let's make sure all the auto-loads... Ah, okay, there it is. I do not have my auto-load set up. So let's set that up real fast. Auto-load. And then this is a PSR... Whoops, PSR4, and, whoops, let's not forget my colons there. And then this should basically be, what do we have here? Underneath source is my start testing PHP, right? Okay, so I'm pretty sure it is the name of your namespace. I don't write this very often because it's normally just kind of already in the project, and then source. I'm going to assume that's okay. I might need those. I don't remember. I don't think so, though. Let's leave those off. This is where having Slack open would have helped. Let's run dump autoload. Oh, there you go. It does end in a namespace separator. Thank you, Composer. All right, let's try that again. A non-empty PSR prefix must end... A non-empty PSR prefix... Oh. Wrong way. There we go. All right, cool. Let's see if all that's better in the world. Ah, cool, great. That's much better. Okay, so now that we got that fixed, let's start over here and look at this error. Okay, cool. So this is our test, received query, but no expectations were specified. Great, so we saw this before, right? With the mock that we have, if we don't set something up, right, if we don't set up query to return what we would expect, then Mockery is actually going to throw an exception in this case. We don't even get down to our assertion failure. So let's close Composer and PHPUnit there and get our screens back the way we like. So let's get back to Mockery now. We have set up our PHPUnit test correctly, but with Mockery, we need to stub out our database connection and tell it what we want it to do, right? So we should receive query. And for what we've learned so far, let's just say and return false, right? Because that's going to set up this path the way we want and get us in a path where we would potentially return an empty array. All right. Great, we pass. Okay, so that's pretty good, but let's learn a little bit more about Mockery. So this is nice and this works, but again, if we're testing at this level of granularity, right, we really could be a little more strict about what we're testing. And let's also, for the purposes of learning, learn a little bit more about Mockery. So let's do some stuff here, right? Let's expect some arguments, right? Because we're going to expect that we get called with a very specific query, like this is important to us, right? It's important that obviously we're selecting just note, we're not selecting star, for example. Maybe that's kind of a convention that you use as a team, to save, you kind of fine tune your queries. And then let's also say, it's kind of business critical that the order by created, like your newest ones are first, right? So let's use this with args, and we're going to pass in, whoops, PHP Storm being a little overly helpful there. And we're going to pass in that, right? So we're going to make sure, hey, look, not only did you receive query, but you also received it with this argument, and then you're going to return false. So let's run this again. Uh-oh, with args with an invalid argument. You know what? I think it's just with, maybe, or with arg. There's two different versions, and yeah, there's two different versions in Mockery. So with args, I think has to be an array, or you can do with and they're comma separated with the different arguments. So I think with is a little bit more common to use. I'm not sure why we're getting an odd highlighting in PHP Storm though, but anyways, everything's good there. We're passing. So let's push on. So that's a real simple test there. So let's make another test. Let's test kind of like this other path here, but in this case, num rows, we're going to kind of move down the line. So false is good, it returns. Let's move down the line here and make sure that when we do return some kind of object, its num rows is equal to 0, then we would also get an empty array back. So let's say public function test all returns empty array when query has no results, right? All right. So we're going to do basically the same thing here. So I'm just going to copy paste a little bit of this. So let's go ahead and set up our subject. Whoa, let's set up our subject. Great. And then we're also going to set this up to receive everything it received a minute ago. But in this case, we want to return something else, right? Let's leave that alone for just a second. And then let's copy this actual bit here. So let's, for now, I'm just going to return null, right? And let's run this and watch it explode. Great, okay, so trying to get property of non-object. So we can see where this failed, line 21. So we can look over here, line 21. So it didn't return false, right? So it's not strictly equal to false. So it's going to go over here and it's going to say null arrow num rows is equal to 0. So obviously that's a little bit of a problem. So we need to return an object. So instead of returning false, or in this case, while we were just stubbing things out, null, let's return something here. And what I'm going to return here, I'm going to demonstrate using a dummy. And in this case, I'm just kind of being pedantic again about that terminology, but just to kind of emphasize this here. We could make another mock object, right? And we could create a property on that mock object when it called num rows, for example, to return 0. But again, I don't like using Mockery to necessarily make these generic objects, like these generic test objects. I want to instead kind of set them up in a way, or I want to instead try to push myself to see if there's something else I can do. So in this case, if I really only care about num rows, like this one property on here, I can really just make just a standard class object, right? So I can just say new standard class, right? And then I can just say dummy num rows, right? Automatically make with the dynamic nature of PHP, I can automatically make this property on here, this public property, immediately. And I can say, okay, look, your num rows is 0, return that dummy object when you're called with this, and we should now not be getting these null exceptions we should actually have an object here, just some dummy object, that has a numRows property on it of 0. So again, not necessarily using Mockery in this example. We'll use Mockery again here in a minute, but for now, I'm not going to mess with it. I'm just going to use this dummy object. So let's see how far this gets us. Great, everything passes. Let's just change this to 1 real fast again, just to see that we moved a little farther. Okay, great. So we see call to undefined method standard class fetch assoc. And that's basically because this failed. We moved down here and we actually got in a situation where it was trying to call on line 26. It was actually got farther in the code and tried to call this fetch assoc, which obviously we don't have set up yet. But that's a good indicator that this test setup is actually going to help us kind of keep moving forward to the next. So let's do that. Let's push on just to a few more tests, and then I'll open it up to questions here. So let's do test all returns tasks when query has results, right? So this is kind of a little bit better of a test here. So we could keep pushing on this standard class. So we saw that we have this dummy. We can set this up to be 2, for example, and then obviously that's going to push on and give us kind of this same error in our code that we saw a second ago, right? It's going to get to line 26 and it's going to attempt to call this fetch assoc, but there is no fetch assoc on this dummy object. Now again, we could kind of do some very dynamic stuff here in PHP to kind of make it work. We could say something like dummy, fetch assoc, and we could assign some closure to it. That starts to get pretty weird, right? So let's go back to using a mock. So instead here, let's say something like result equals mockery mock. And what I'm going to do is really what query returns is a MySQL result object, right? So here it is here. So we could try to do this, and let's just toy around with this for a second. And let's say result equals, result numRows equals 2. All right, let's see if this gets us farther. Okay, so there's a really interesting thing that happens here. It says cannot write property. And where this comes from is actually underneath the hood in the MySQL I result object, the numRows property is read only. Now that's not something that's exposed to us in PHP in like user land. We can't necessarily mark a property as read only. But underneath the covers inside of like the PHP engine, they can actually do that. And because of that, we can't necessarily use this MySQL result class directly and then overwrite that numRows property. Again, that's something that's kind of generated automatically, so we're not able to mess with it. It's a very interesting error and pretty specific to this code sample, but I want to bring it up for 2 reasons. One, as much as I do like using this class directly, there are going to be some times, especially in the case of when you're trying to mock out core like native PHP objects, that you might not have, let's call it visibility, right, into certain properties. You might not be able to really mock those out. So when that happens, and kind of leading me to my second point, you have a couple different choices. You could over here do something instead of numRows. You could, set it up to where you call a method, right? I don't think it's count, but there might be like a row count. There's a method that represents numRows inside of this result. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but you could modify your code to do that. I don't necessarily like going down the road where I'm kind of having to write code in a certain way to test it a certain way, right? I think that starts really getting down that road where, you hear a lot of people talk about, oh, well, when you write your code that way or when you're writing your test that way, they're too coupled, right? You're kind of just writing a test to test the implementation line by line by line. And I think in that case, you're definitely doing that, right? You're definitely having to write code in a very certain way for it to be tested a very certain way. And I think that's dangerous. So what we're going to do is just kind of go back to just creating a generic mock object. We're not necessarily going to try to necessarily mock out the MySQL results class, because we're going to start running into these like low-level core problems, and this is one that I noticed before. There are others, but definitely, again, continue to try to use them if you can, but if you start running into these things where like you're just not able to stub out methods and you're getting some very interesting errors that might not make a whole lot of sense, you're not getting like the Mockery or PHPUnit level errors, you're getting these interesting like cannot write property. That seems a little bit strange, right? So let's just drop that instance mock that we were creating a second ago and just go back to just a generic mock. So we can, this is just an object like anything else, so we can just set that numRows property immediately, and we should be back to where we can't, oh, it's not dumb anymore, sorry, it is result. And, okay, good, so fetch_assoc doesn't exist on this mock object. Great, so we're back to where we started, just a slightly different exception now. So let's set up, back using Mockery, let's set up fetch_assoc, right? And fetch_assoc is going to receive, there's no arguments, so let's return. And we'll notice that return can actually take an array. So it's a little bit interesting. So we can actually set something up if it's going to be called multiple times to basically be like call 1, call 2, call 3, right? And it's just going to keep returning those until it effectively runs out. So if we think about the way that fetch_assoc kind of behaves in the real world, is that basically it's going to return a result, and then it's going to return finally like null or false or whatever that last time, so that while loop dumps out. So let's just have it. It's going to give us 1 object back, 2 object back, and then it's going to return null. So let's see how far this gets us. Okay, so great. So we did get farther. We got down to free. So let's keep pushing on here. So what we're also going to do is, now we're not going to assert that we get back an empty task list anymore, right? So we've gotten down to this free part. Let's make sure that we actually get some tasks back though, right? Because if we looped over 2 things, we should be getting 2 tasks back. So let's do this. Let's say actual, we should get back a note, right? So let's say actual 0, so this first task that we get back should be something like task 1. And the second task we get back is task 2, right? And we could also, just for giggles, we could say something like assert count, and we could say actual, whoops, we expect its count to be 2, right? All right, cool. So we should get an array back, right, of tasks where we say 2 of them are in there, and then, whoops, sorry, this should also kind of imply that it's a task object, so we can call get note on that. We should remember that from earlier, that model that we had built, and that should occur, right? Okay, we're still going to run into this free, right, because we're back in that scenario where Mockery doesn't allow us to call anything if we haven't stubbed it out, right? So if we haven't set it up to do anything, it's not going to allow us to kind of mock, or it's not going to allow us to keep going. So for right now, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but just to push us on to these assertions here, I'm just going to comment out that line of code, because that is the last piece I want to cover. Okay, great. So now we got null is identical to task 1. So you might have thought, okay, well, that and return was a little interesting. I just put 1, 2, and null. So let's talk about this a little bit more. What we need to return here basically is fetch_assoc returns an associative array, right? And because of that, we need to set it up to not necessarily return 1 and 2. We need to return some more interesting bits here, right? So what we need to return is a note associative array, right, for those tasks. So let's say this is task 1, and this is going to be a note. And we've worked with MySQL, data records enough where we can basically just kind of reason about the way this should look. So again, on the left, the associative array is going to be the column name, and then on the right, it's going to be the value. So in this case, note is our column name, and then the value should basically just match what we've kind of asserted down here, right? So let's run this. Awesome, everything passes, cool. So a little bit of setup here, and this required kind of knowing the way the system was going to behave. And again, this gets to that point that I was mentioning a couple times now, that we're really kind of testing in a way line by line here, right? We have to kind of set up these mocks in very specific ways to behave as they would in the real world. So it requires us knowing, some things about that code. Oops. All right. I feel like I copy-pasted something weird there. Let me make sure. Okay, good. All right, and the last thing I want to do is, a second ago I commented out this free part, right? Well, free's not really doing anything, but maybe it's important to us. Maybe we have a really, really large task list, right? Maybe we're Basecamp, and it's important that when we call this task repository all, that we're freeing that result up from like a memory perspective. So again, while this might seem like a rather trivial line, it's something that probably matters in this case, and we want to make sure that we call it. So it doesn't make sense to say should receive on it necessarily. What makes sense is to verify that it was called, because there's no really output result of this. It's not like query where we return something and use it in our code, or fetch a source where we return something and use it in the code. It's just kind of this freestanding independent line of code that we need to make sure something happens on it. So what we want to do here is, after we make our invocation, we can actually verify something on that mock actually happened. So I can say result should have received free, and we can even say something like once. So make sure that free got called at some point. We can't really assert that it got called whether it was here or up here. Maybe it was called at the very top, but reliably the code necessarily wouldn't work if you called free much higher. So we can trust again that it's working and behaving correctly so long as you called free one time. And again, it doesn't make sense to call it twice or whatever. So sometimes tacking on those extra little configuration bits are nice. And they also demonstrate the additional things that they can do. Okay, cool. So free does not exist on this mock object. We're still getting that same error. This is where Mockery gets a little bit silly, but we also have to make sure that in this case, we're not really setting up a mock, we're setting up a spy. And the difference between a mock and a spy on the surface is really that you can do this. And I say on the surface because really a mock object can do the same thing. We would just have to set it up to ignore missing. But let me demonstrate. Let me hold that thought for a second. I'll demonstrate that here in a second. So instead of making a mock object directly, we're going to make a spy, which behaves very similar to the way a mock does, but also allows us to make these verifications on it. So let's run this, make sure everything works. And it does, great. We got called once. Again, I might be able to change this to twice, and we should see an error here, right? So it should have been called exactly 2 times, but only called 1 time. So just to kind of demonstrate that extra little bit there. So underneath the covers, spy is really a mock that should ignore missing. And let me just demonstrate that. So I went back to a mock, but I tacked on that should ignore missing, and I'm still green. But a spy does pretty much the exact same thing. And if we look under the covers of spy, I just command click through to the actual implementation in the code. If we see spy, it really just makes a mock and calls should ignore missing on it. So it's just a shorthand. Really, they're both the exact same thing as far as the mock object that's created. They behave in the same way. Some people like to see this spy here because it just communicates that, oh, I'm going to make some verifications that method calls actually happened. But I'm still able to set it up and do things with it just as I would any other mock. So it's a little bit interesting though, because a spy won't necessarily complain when you don't implement a should receive on it, right? So I'm not going to move on to create because I think there was a lot that was covered here. So what I'd rather do is open it up to questions just to make sure we've kind of covered enough of the basics. And we'll go into a lot more detail and kind of a more robust system next time. So let me fire up Slack here, which I think last time took quite a minute to fire up with the CPU burning. So let's see what's happening. While that's firing up, let me make sure that everything is still running correctly. Great. All right, cool. And again, while this is coming up, you guys, if you want to jump over to the questions channel, you can start posting any of your questions in there. But again, this might take a second or two. I know last time it took like 45 seconds to fire up. Seems like everything's still pushing, so that's good. All right, slowly but surely getting there. Great. Okay, cool. So it looks like there were a few questions in here. So yeah, if you want to jump over to the questions channel, I know I saw some things in workshop. I'll try to pull them over. But yeah, if anybody is still on the live stream and wants to ask some live questions, I'll be glad to use the last 15 minutes or so here to try to answer some of them. So thanks for those that watched live while we're waiting on some questions to come in. I see a few typers, so while you're doing that, again, I'll just remind everybody of the repo. Or well, it's probably better just to, let's just open up Chrome here and share it out the right way. That way you guys can see all the links. All right, so let's go to github.com, Jason McCreary, and then start-testing-php. I think that was it. Cool, so I'll share this out to everybody in Slack. Let's see, please post in questions. All right, cool. So repo from, whoops. So this is the repo from the workshop. Cool. And then there was, I also mentioned that Mockery bit. Let me jump out to dev2. I posted this, I think, last week or so. Whoops, that's not it. What are the users? I think there's like a... I'm in here somewhere. There I am. Yay. This is the other post that I mentioned the other day. Is this kind of joke here, fake it by stubbing the mock dummy, just talking about all of the different nomenclature and just kind of the nuances between these different dummies, fakes, stubs, spies, and again, you heard me using them a lot during the workshop. At the end, they don't really matter, and I also kind of built this fancy little test double helper inside of Mockery. So instead of having to kind of remember all the time the should receive and like, you know, to ignore missing and so forth, I kind of just made this simpler, in my opinion, double class. It's just kind of a top level helper method, so I'll share that out as well. Okay, so that's that post, which also has a link to the same bit. So let me jump back over to questions and see here. Okay, what happens in the red-green refactor loop when Mockery in your test has been so tightly bound to the implementation? Yes, that's an excellent point. So what we're talking about here is, or I guess what's being asked here is, okay, for example, let's say that this loop that I was doing down here, I go over here and somehow during kind of a refactor of the code, all my tests are passing, everything's good, but I notice later in development that like, oh, this could be, you know, done in a different way. And I start changing this up in some way, right? I start changing up like result, you know, something like not result and things like that. I'm trying to think of a good example here that I can kind of mess with. Maybe I don't fetch a source anymore, right? Maybe I just, because I know there's just one bit here, maybe I do fetch row because I later find out that that's faster, right? I'm not fetching an associative array anymore. I'm just fetching a row with one object. So this is a good example, I think, off the top of my head to demonstrate that. Now, when I go and run this test, my test is going to fail, right? Because it failed asserting that the actual size 0 matches expected size 2. Well, the point that's being made by the question is that because I've kind of granularly tested, I've kind of tested very specifically that I was calling fetch assoc, and it gave me back this very specifically formatted array, that if I ever wanted to go in and kind of change this up with a simple refactor, my test is going to break now. I think that's an excellent point, and I think that's where you have to kind of try to find a balance of what makes sense in your code, right? If you're finding that you're having to change tests a lot because this method's changing constantly, it may be better to write some kind of integration test, right? Some kind of test that's not super granular at this level. Again, I've done this to demonstrate kind of the purpose of Mockery and how we used it in a couple different ways and how we can use it at a real granular level. But yeah, for sure, if you're in a place where your tests are super tightly coupled to a very, very specific implementation, I think that's a really common point that people make kind of against writing, these types of tests, right? Not necessarily writing unit tests, but writing this kind of specific line by line kind of mocking. And I think the challenge is, again, to maybe back that test off a little bit to where maybe it's not testing this so specifically, right? Maybe it's doing something else. Maybe you have some kind of helper or something that you're able to mock in a uniform way. But that's the challenge, right? Your tests are telling you something here. That whole process, if nothing else, is telling you, hey, not only that your tests are super tightly coupled, but how could the code change where you're not necessarily having to jump to the conclusion of writing an integration test? You don't have to abandon this unit test and go straight to integration. There's some gray in between, right, where you might be able to say, oh, maybe this while loop here could be better served in another way. So definitely push yourself. Don't just abandon, writing tests, writing unit tests, for example, and jumping straight to some kind of integration or end-to-end test, as people call them. So it's a very good point, though, right? Like I think that is a challenge. But in the real world, you might not be writing this level of granularity. Maybe you are. But again, this is a very low-level piece of the system, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay that it's this tightly coupled, right? Will I be speaking at LairCon? I have no idea. I hope so. But yeah, let's I guess let's save that for later. Okay, next question. As far as I know, if you are spying, you shouldn't be able to return custom values. What do you think about that? Yeah, you're right. Because of the way Mockery is written, a spy and a mock are really the exact same thing. But I think more generally what you're asking is that if you're spying on something, you really shouldn't be able to manipulate it. You should really just kind of be listening passively in the background. So yeah, that's kind of why I think it's interesting that they've denoted the difference between a mock and a spy as kind of a testing framework. But underneath the covers, they're both still mocks, and you can just as easily still kind of stub out methods and manipulate their values, even though you're supposed to just be spying. So not a very big differentiation in Mockery. I do think other testing frameworks might make a little bit more stricter of a line there, but just quickly coming to mind, Jasmine, which is a JavaScript testing or a node testing framework, they kind of only have spies, but you're also able to kind of manipulate the values or stub them out. So again, it really boils down to the testing tool that you're using, whether or not they choose to be that strict. But generally speaking, yeah, it shouldn't. Maybe it shouldn't behave that way. Okay, another question here. On a large code base, do you normally split up unit tests versus integration tests? Talking about different types of tests for the same class. Do I personally? No, I don't always split them up. You've probably noticed me kind of dodge the question a couple times here, or kind of hint at maybe the answer. I just write tests. I try not to get caught up in stubs and mocks and dummies and fakes and spies, and I try not to get caught up in unit tests and integration test and end-to-end test. What I really care about is that the code is tested. Some of the code might be tested, as we've seen here, in kind of an overly strict way, in a limiting way, and I'm fully willing to admit that. And then other bits of the code might test in a very loose way. So, for example, if I did write an integration test, maybe I'm only testing kind of the happy path, right? I'm not testing all the little pieces, all the different user flows, because that would take potentially a lot of integration tests, and that's common. That's kind of the common argument against things like integration tests, is that you got to write a lot of them, or they're really slow, or whatever. I think there's a bunch of ways to mitigate that. So again, the point being is, I try not to get too caught up, and then what I try to test is behavior, and I try to test what matters, and matters meaning is business critical. So we kind of talked about this result free earlier. That's something that, maybe again, I'm dealing with very large data sets, right? So that result free is very important. So I want to kind of granularly test result free. That's not something that I would necessarily be able to get through an integration test or an end-to-end test unless I was like looking at memory counts, like within PHP. But there could be all sorts of reasons that the memory, was getting shifted around in the system. So an integration test is not very good for something like that, for example. Result free is the thing I absolutely want to make sure that I'm calling. Or, for example, that I'm writing a very specific SQL statement, right? In order to do that, I have to kind of do that at this level. I wouldn't be able to easily have access to do that from an integration test. So I'm only noting the differences to kind of point out strengths and weaknesses. But again, my goal here is to test behavior. I want to make sure that when I call all, it gives me back tasks. And when I call all and something's kind of messed up, it returns an empty array. It doesn't throw an exception for like odd things or whatever. And so long as I'm testing just that, the way in which I test it maybe doesn't matter to me. But again, if I care about testing free, or I care about testing the very exact SQL statement I'm using, I'm probably going to have to get pretty granular with a unit test. But those other things I mentioned could be tested more at a high level with an integration test. So hopefully that helps give you some kind of answer there. But the point to me is, tests are tests. Especially in the beginning, I wouldn't get too caught up in the type of test that you wrote. What matters more is that you're actually testing. You're already ahead of the game if you're truly testing your code. So I don't think many devs do it. So okay, 2 more questions, and then we're going to cut it off. So what is your definition of an integration test? I've heard several different ways people describe them, and I'm curious how you do. I would say an integration test is, I guess by definition, is one that tests potentially collaboration between the systems. So you're not attempting to test in isolation. So, I guess kind of what we were saying here is that in this case, right, I think it's pretty safe to call what I wrote earlier a unit test. And so kind of by the opposing definition here, what is a unit test? It's something where I'm definitely testing in isolation, right? So if I'm testing a broader stroke of the system, or more pieces of the system, even though I'm only calling all, I would classify that, just me personally. I'm not saying this is a overall definition, but to me, it would mean that all is actually collaborating and interacting with the real parts of the other system. I haven't isolated it to just be, limited to itself, meaning, only using these mock objects, and it doesn't have any connection outside of itself. So, quite literally, there's a connection here in the code. If I were truly connecting to the database in this example, I think that's a pretty classic example of of where people would probably start to call it an integration test. It's actually integrating with the database. It's actually calling the database, getting real records, and kind of doing its thing from there. And I think because of that, it would be very difficult to test the way in which we tested, as I mentioned before, to test things like free and stuff if you were running an integration test. If you were testing by truly connecting to the database and truly returning a result, there's no way for me to kind of stub out and control and verify that free got called with at least the simplicity of kind of this one-liner that we've done here. That's not to say it couldn't be tested. It's just you'd have to come up with a different way to do so under an integration test. So yeah, just to kind of give you a summary answer there, integration test really, in my mind, is anything that truly collaborates with some kind of other part of the system. It's not self-contained, right? It's not isolated, which meaning it's basically just not a unit test. So, all right, last point, and then I'm gonna cut it off. So, okay, let's see. Oh, good, you're welcome. I'm glad that answered it. And then how does this inline assignment work? Data equals new foo. Data can be passed to other mocks with data. Example. Okay, so you have this example here. You're doing some kind of like inline assignment. Yeah, I mean, obviously that can work just by the nature of PHP, right? Because whatever you assign is kind of just the result of an assignment. So the value that's being assigned is going to be what's returned from an assignment statement. So I typically don't write code that. I mean, obviously what you have works. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure kind of what you're asking here. But this could work. I tend to avoid things like that. I think in this case, especially of like a chained method call already, that's really, it doesn't communicate very well. Like that code seems, it would seem difficult for me to read as another developer. I'd rather see data assigned above this service line and then just used like it's used down here, where it's like return data with data. That's a lot more clear in my mind. I don't have to dissect each individual line here. I think a lot of devs would miss that line personally. Should you always avoid hitting the database in a unit test? I think by definition, yes. I think by definition, a unit test probably shouldn't hit the database, because then it's truly collaborating with another part of the system, which would make it not a unit test. So not to be too technical on you, but yes, I would think for a unit test, you would try to avoid hitting the database. Final question, do you think unit tests are necessary if you have integration tests for everything? Ooh, challenge of everything. I'm going to leave you with another. JB Rainsberger is big in testing. He's a bit more into the I guess he's a bit more kind of in Java land, but he has all sorts of courses and so forth. But this came obviously from a while back now, and he's received a lot of blowback from it. But I would definitely watch maybe the first 15 minutes of this. It's pretty cool. He definitely is very passionate about it, so it's fun. I'm not saying totally agree with it or anything like that. I'm just saying that I think it's a good for the other side, because I think that in some communities integration tests are kind of the way, and then some communities unit tests are the way, and people are really passionate about both. In this case, he's very passionate about integration tests being a scam, of course. Again, like I mentioned before, bottom line is there's two sides to every coin. I just cared that we're testing. I'm not too worried about how many tests you have of each. But I do think, again, the first 15 minutes of his video will kind of answer your question about, kind of challenge the fact that you have truly written integration tests for everything. So definitely give it a watch. I'll be in the Slack room, but I'm going to go ahead and shut down the stream.